Alrighty, here's the deal, folks. This is going to be our first video. It's going to be a little test, just to kind of see how things roll. We're going to keep it loose and easy, and let's just get right into it. My name is Mike. I am a amateur historian. I went to school and got a bachelor's degree in history. I used to be a high school history teacher. And now I just kind of want to put that content out on the internet. I miss doing it, and I just wanted to get back into it, and I figured this might be a fun way to do it. So we're going to start off with American history, and I haven't decided yet whether or not I'm going to do everything in order or bounce around as my interests find me, but regardless, we're going to start here at what is arguably the beginning of American history as most people think about it. And it's the colonies before the United States declares independence, beginning with the initial portions of the French and Indian War. So let's get into it. Background. So Columbus is largely credited with discovering the New World. If you subscribe to that narrative, there's really, that could be a whole video in and of itself. He is one of the first traditional Europeans to sail there. Now, a couple years later, in 1497, you get Amerigo Vespucci. He lands in South America and then heads north, as opposed to Columbus doing the opposite, okay? His importance is really the mapping of the the eastern coasts of the Americas. That's why they're named after Vespucci, because all of the maps came back with his name on them. And then we're going to jump forward to the Mayflower and Plymouth. If you guys remember your elementary school education, especially if you grew up in New England, they made it out to be a very big deal. They did found the beginnings of what would become the traditional 13 colonies, but there were a whole heck of a lot of expeditions and people, European people in North America before that. Roanoke, Jamestown, things like that. Their success rate is arguable. I grew up in western Massachusetts, so this is I like to spend a little bit of time on this. So we get Plymouth in 1620. That's obviously right on the coast. And then they start moving inland. The easiest way to move inland at this time is rivers. Basically, as far as you can go up the Connecticut River, what is now known as the Connecticut River, with a large ship before it gets too shallow to go any further, you get to what is now Springfield, Massachusetts. That city is founded in 1636. And that is where a lot of industry is going to be held for a very long time, simply because that's as far as you can sail up the river effectively and efficiently. I have a lot of stuff about West Springfield on here, which is an adjacent town to the west of Springfield, as I'm sure you can imagine, because that's where I was teaching at this time, and I thought the kids in that town would like to know a little bit more about where they live, but not huge in terms of wider American history, certainly not as much as Springfield. The Springfield is where a lot of arms manufacture is going to be. Smith & Wesson just moved out of there. It's going to be a big deal in terms of industry in the north moving forward, so just keep that in mind. The economy. How is the world working right now? Basically, everything that has to do with what we're going to talk about for the foreseeable future has to do with what's called triangular trade. And if you look at the map I have here, it makes a triangle. That's why it's called that. Now, what you're getting is basically a cycle. the new colonies are getting manufactured goods from Europe, all right? Because there is yet to be that industry that we just talked about that's still being built up. What is coming from the colonies is a lot of natural resources. Lumber and furs are going to be huge for a very long time, especially out of the Northeast like we just talked about. As people move and settle further and further south, sugar is going to become increasingly important. Sugar is going to be what powers this triangular trade for the most part. It's going to be responsible for a lot of different things. Now, on the other side, we have Europeans going directly south to Africa, Gold Coast, things like that, Ivory Coast over there. And what they're bringing with them are what they're good at, manufactured goods. It starts off with raw iron, iron products, beer, cloth, smithed items, swords, knives, tools, and then eventually guns. And guns is what's going to kick us off the same way that sugar is on the other side. What happens is these Europeans are going to trade Africans guns in exchange for slaves. Those Africans are going to go take those guns, move a little bit further inland, and wage what is essentially a manufactured or artificial war against other Africans. And the explicit and only point, the only thing driving this, these wars, these skirmishes, are to gain POWs, and those POWs are going to be taken by other Africans and set up on the coast in cages to be traded and sold to Europeans, who are then going to ship them across to the Americas. Now, as these Europeans are moving down, there's a lot of islands right here that you can see on the map. Sugarcane is going to originate around this area, and it's going to get picked up and moved further and further south. And people are going to realize, it grows pretty good here, but it also grows even better here. And then, we're going to take it across over here. And in the Caribbean is where sugarcane is going to explode. And now we are going to have both this influx of sugarcane that needs to be, worked on and harvested. And now we also have this influx of a massive and essentially free workforce. So all of the guns that get traded for slaves over here, those slaves are going to come mostly to the Caribbean, and those slaves are going to work on sugar plantations almost entirely. It is very hard to overstate how many slaves went to the Caribbean to simply work on sugar plantations. Why is sugar such a big deal? For a very long time, the only remotely easy way to get sugar was through honey. And now we have a way to get it for a European or a colonist fairly easy. And alcohol is huge. The alcohol that gets made from sugar is rum. Rum in particular, because there's so much sugar, but alcohol in general is a big deal because it's essentially a non-perishable good, unlike a lot of things at this time, unless you're looking at like heavily salted meats or bricks of tea. Most everything else is perishable, including water. And this journey from Europe to North America, to the colonies, on a good trip is going to take you 6 weeks, and you need a lot of water to do that. Well, rum essentially is going to be used as a non-perishable form of water. It's going to get so big, in fact, that the Royal Navy, the Britain's Navy, part of their pay, part of their rations is rum. They get a rum ration. And when they realize that everybody's getting scurvy because of a lack of vitamin D, they take limes and just put them in the rum for the vitamin C. Did I say vitamin C? I meant vitamin C if I didn't say that. They put limes in the rum for vitamin C to fend off the scurvy. It's going to be a big deal. That is very overly simplified. If you guys want to talk more about that, let me know, and I can do a whole video just on triangular trade. But that's broad strokes. Moving on, the colonies are agrarianism. They're farming at best and trapping at the worst. The British colonies are going to do a lot of farming and pseudo ranching, and the French colonies are going to do a lot of trapping and hunting. The British colonial mindset of this pseudo-ranching and farming is going to also increase a demand for this slave labor that we now have a steady stream of coming from Africa because of the demand for slaves for sugar. Now it's going to translate over to farming as well. All right. The French and Indian War, again, very big oversimplification, but let's get through it. Let's get at it. They've been fighting forever. France and Britain don't get along basically until World War I. They have hated each other forever. Nothing is new here. What is new is that this idea of like a proxy war, because Britain and France aren't really doing the fighting, but British and French colonies are doing the fighting. So you look at our map, you can see where we have British claims and French claims, and then we have some overlapping stuff, and then some actual Spanish stuff further south. There's border skirmishes basically the entire time that there are colonies here. And in 1754, it expands because the French start allying with some native peoples. Why didn't the British do this? The British kind of kept to themselves, in the fact that the French were doing the trapping and the hunting put them more in the native people's backyards. They interacted with them far more. Not that the British didn't, but the French just happened to do it more. I have join or die on here as a separate little bullet, because if you look up here in the top right, that join or die flag, that thing that you see people misusing all the time, that was like the first political cartoon ever. Benjamin Franklin drew that in 1754, and if you see, the head of the snake is New England, and then we have almost all of the other 13 colonies. If you look, it's minus Georgia and Delaware. Why that is a little bit long of a story. They weren't getting the same message that everybody else was, long story short. So what we have here is what is essentially the first time the colonies needed to come together and act as one. For the most part, the colonies were acting fairly independently from the late 1600s up until what is now 1754. There was interstate trade, but they had independent militias, and they didn't really work together on a large scale. But now they have to, because the French are getting very aggressive. Again, broad strokes here. In Europe, This is called the 7 Years' War. In the United States, it's called the French and Indian War. Neither one of those are great are great names. When I was teaching, I would say, all right, we're going to learn about the French and Indian War, and everybody assumed that the French were fighting the Indians, which is not true. And then you'd say, okay, we're going to learn about the 7 Years' War, and everybody would be like, oh, it lasted 7 years. Well, no, it lasted 9 years. It's annoying either way. In Europe, it's especially in the UK, it's called the 7 Years' War because mainland Britain, the overarching government, the monarchy, as an easy way to put that. The monarchy didn't get involved with this conflict until 1756. So for them, it was a 7-year war. But the colonists were fighting largely without help from the monarchy for several years before that. Now, in the context of the American Revolution, what do we need to know? Why do we friggin' care? It was expensive. That is the biggest part. Fighting this war for nearly a decade was very, very costly. And I'm going to tell you right now, so you have this in your head as we move forward, this is going to be the indirect cause of the American Revolution. Keep that in your mind. It will become more clear later, but it is basically the taxes that get applied to the colonists to recoup the losses of this war that they get upset about and then start a war over. So, moving on. How does the government generate revenue? Well, taxes. And there's going to be a lot of them, and it's going to be on stuff that was never previously taxed, and it's going to be on stuff that is very important to the colonists. Okay, so anything made with sugar is going to be covered by the Sugar Act. Anything that sugar goes into, the Sugar Act is going to tax. So, all of the things we talked about being super important a minute ago, raw sugar itself, absolutely. Rum, absolutely. And we just talked about how important rum is becoming, especially in like the seafaring community. Rum is a staple. It's a big deal. That's how you survive. That's how you pay a lot of people. A byproduct of making rum is molasses. Molasses gets used a lot because as a byproduct it's fairly cheap. It does kind of the same things as honey. Honey is expensive. So now molasses is being taxed as well. A couple other taxes on things that you don't normally associate with sugar. Silk, wine, coffee, and indigo, kind of basically just as a tax on luxury items. The thought process there was if you can afford luxury items, you can afford to pay a little bit more. And if it's a percentage, that tax percentage will be more easily offsetting those costs of the French and Indian War. Now, the problem with this is it is, as seen by the colonists, it's stripping their rights of English people. Because now that there's a tax on these products, the government can search and seize property, any property, but what we are mostly caring about is merchants because, like again, a lot of this is toward the seafaring folk. That is how everything's getting done. Triangular trade, keep that in mind. Everything's getting done by ship. So that's a lot what we're going to focus on. So it's a lot of merchant ships being seized for what is sometimes legitimate reasons of, untaxed smuggled goods. But a lot of times, honestly, it was an abuse of power because they were easy targets. There was no innocent until proven guilty. There was none of that stuff. It was actually the other way around. If your stuff got seized, you had to prove that the taxes were paid and it was a legal product. And until then, it would remain seized. And we just talked about how a lot of these are perishable items. So your stuff goes bad while you're trying to prove that you were doing the right thing. People are very, very upset. It throws due process right out the window. It also, as if that weren't bad enough, if your stuff was improperly seized, other than trying to prove that your stuff was legal and your taxes were paid, there was no legal recourse for you. You couldn't sue anybody. It actually prohibited lawsuits against the crown and their, for lack of a better word, enforcers of this kind of thing, the people who were working the docks for the British government at the time. What is important to remember also is the colonists had paid taxes, but mostly to what was effectively their own colonial governments. This was the first time that the colonists in North America paid taxes directly to the British government, directly to the crown. And they did not take kindly to this for a lot of reasons that we will get into a little bit later. Now, the Stamp Act is what comes next. The Sugar Act is doing well for the recourse for the war, but it's not enough, okay? So, 1765 in November, we get the Stamp Act. And essentially, anything that is a stationary item, stationary with an E, is now taxed. So you can see the list here. Everything from mortgage deeds to playing cards, everything. And again, in today's society, we don't think about it because, you go to the DMV or City Hall or whatever, and, you don't get out of there without paying for some fee for some piece of paper. But that wasn't the norm at the time. And having to pay for these items in general, but now a tax on top of it to prove that you own your house. It was ridiculous. You got to think about it. These people are moving essentially across the world, clearing their own land, chopping down their own trees, building their own house, building their own homestead, their own farm, and now, for whatever reason, they need to prove that it's theirs, and they have to pay an extra tax to do it. They're not thrilled. So, summer of the following year, in 1755, the Sons of Liberty are founded by Sam Adams. And they were... vigilante isn't the right word, but non-traditional recourse is what they specialized in. And they first went after the people who were enforcing the Stamp Act. They were intimidating, for a nice word. They were intimidating the guys who were running the stuff, the stamp distributors. And they did traditional stuff like public demonstrations and things of that nature, but there was definitely a extreme side to the Sons of Liberty. They would go to hanging effigies. Eventually, they would go as far as tarring and feathering and hanging people and things of that nature. Things to remember about tarring and feathering is it's not, obviously, it's a terrible amount of pain and it's a terrible amount of embarrassment. But you got to remember, these people almost always died of infection afterwards. It's not like you got off easy because you didn't get hung. You just had to deal with the pain of being tarred and feathered. No, you also died a very slow, painful death of infection. Anyways, in the fall of 1765, we get delegates from most of the colonies, and they form what is going to be known as the Stamp Act Congress. It's not called that right away, but for our purposes, we're going to say that it is. They issue what they call the Declaration of Rights and Grievances. And this is where the famous no taxation without representation things comes from. So what they're really getting at here is They are being taxed by a government who does not take their opinions or what they want into effect when creating policy. They have no say in what those tax dollars go to. They have no say in anything. They are not part of Parliament. They don't have any representation in Parliament. So that is where no taxation without representation comes from, because the colonies have no representation at this point in Parliament. So they're saying, all right, if you're going to make us pay taxes, at least let us have a say, rather. The Crown basically doesn't care. The Stamp Act is enacted right after the Sugar Act. They're both pretty much ignored by anyone who can ignore them. The Sugar Act is a little bit harder for the merchants and things like we talked about, without legal recourse and things like that. But you got to remember, a lot of the positions that are being held by people who are selling things on which things are printed on paper are not run by the government. They're run by regular people. If you go to try to buy a pack of playing cards from the general store, and that guy is a Sons of Liberty aligned kind of person, he's not going to charge you the tax. And I'd be willing to bet pretty hard that he got those cards from a smuggler and he didn't pay the taxes either. So it's that kind of thing. That's how those things get ignored. And if they're not being ignored by way of smuggling, essentially, this is where the first large boycott comes into place. And it's British goods across the board. And you say, well, what are they going to survive on? They're not self-sufficient at this point. What they're surviving on are simply, guns, supplies from other countries. France, while not thrilled with the British after the French and Indian War, they're happy to take their money. They were happy to go into British colonial ports and sell their goods. Who is going to be same with the Spanish, same kind of idea, but who is going to come in very, very clutch for the colonists are going to be the Dutch. They are going to subvert the UK quite a bit, as we'll see moving forward. And we see this boycott not by just citizens themselves, but business people. A group of several hundred merchants comes together and they sign a non-importation agreement, basically to not buy any of these British goods until these acts are repealed. And they're going to get all their stuff largely from the Dutch, the French, and the Spanish. Now, turns out this works great. It's awesome. And the Brits can't collect any of the money that the colonists owed them. And they figured, a small amount of money is better than no money. So they repeal the Stamp Act and try to recoup some of that money on different taxes on different items. Now, at the same time, a ton of British workers, British-aligned workers, are losing their jobs because orders for the colonies are just not being made and they're canceled to comply with the boycott. So a lot of people who work for not only the British government, but large British import companies like the East India Company are losing their jobs because the Americans aren't buying their goods. So, long story short, super successful. Goes great for the colonists. Now, the definition of insanity, I'm sure you've heard, is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different outcome. Now, if you remember, Britain still needs to pay off all of its debts for the French and Indian War. And the Stamp Act clearly isn't working. So what are we to do? Let's do more taxes. These ones are called the Townson Axe. It's basically it's a bunch of different acts put together that we just now call the Townson Axe. Like I said, it's a whole bunch of different things put together. But it's a bunch of different taxes on different things. You can see them listed here: glass, lead, paper, paint, tea, stuff like that. Now, the first one is huge. Glass is huge. There are no plastic bottles yet. How are we shipping all of this rum everywhere? It's glass. So your alcohol may not be taxed, but the glass that it's in is. Lead is huge. That's what they're making bullets out of at this time. Paper, huge. That's what all of our stuff is printed on. That's why the Stamp Act was so annoying. Paint to a lesser degree, and tea is going to be a big deal. I'm sure you can see where this is going if you have any modicum of familiarity with the American Revolution. And it came with all of the same BS that the Sugar Act did, basically preventing recourse for people who had their stuff seized without due process. The Boston Massacre. So now we're a couple years later. It's fall once again, and people are really fed up with the Townson Axe. People like the Sons of Liberty, but also people who aren't even aligned with the Sons of Liberty and Sam Adams, are getting violent towards customs officers. They're very upset. People are quite frankly, their livelihoods are being ruined by these taxes, and they feel like their rights are being stripped away. It's a very upheaved time. And in response, Britain dispatches a garrison of troops to Boston. A couple years later, now that we have this, we've had a standing police force for a year and a half by March of 1770. And if you thought people were upset before, they're even more upset now. And one of these times, which was very common, that a crowd was harassing customs officers, a set of soldiers steps in, the crowd starts harassing the soldiers by throwing snowballs at them. They were guarding a customs house. Now, supposedly, nobody knows how or why the first shot was fired. All we know is that when the soldiers responded to the customs officer's cry for help, they, for some reason, opened up on the crowd of colonists and killed 5 of them. Couple things going on here. I've heard a lot of different things. I've heard that the classic overzealous British troops wanted to make a point. I've heard that one of the snowballs had a rock in it and it seriously injured one of the soldiers. There's a lot of different things. Quite frankly, we'll never know. And in the grand scheme of things, I don't know how much it genuinely matters. Debate with me down in the comments. Now, it is entirely possible, even probable, that this incident would have immediately started what we think of as the American Revolution. However, Parliament and the Crown being having their wits about them, they immediately repealed the Townson Axe because they knew this was going to start something that they couldn't stop. So they repealed the Townson Axe as basically like an olive branch kind of deal, like, hey, we're listening. This doesn't need to blow up more than it already has. We don't need any more loss of life, that kind of thing. Now, With the Townson Axe being repealed, we're going to go back to smuggling. But we're still pretty upset at the British. So we're not going to deal with the British, and we're going to screw them if we get the chance. So, with the British knowing that Americans are smuggling all kinds of stuff, they had ships patrolling the North Atlantic. One of them was named the Gatsby, not the Gatsby. It gains a terrible reputation. The guy running the ship was a bit of a zealot. He got a reputation for just very much disregarding a person's personal privacy and going out of his way to be a dick, basically. And he searches ships without a warrant. He sends his crew ashore to seize food without payment. He is just known as not a great guy and gets a reputation that the colonists really, really hate him. He makes a fatal mistake a couple years later in 1772. I don't know the details behind this. I would blame it on a poor navigator. But he runs his ship aground, and the colonists find out, and 150 of them wade out into the water and seize all the stuff that's on the ship and then burn it. They weren't fans. Now, we have a little bit of a taste of violence. It was kind of a big win for the Gatsby affair. The colonists felt like they were starting to take back what they thought they deserved. And it's also very important to point out that not all colonists felt this way. There was a large population that were loyal to the crown. We'll talk about it more later, but there was, especially after the French and Indian War, knowing that Britain stepped in to save the colonists, essentially, there was this familial, brotherly bond that a lot of colonists felt with Britain. So keep in mind that not everybody felt the way that the guys who burned the Gatsby and the guys we're about to talk about do. So, Townson Acts are repealed. But there's still taxes on tea, and Dutch tea is way cheaper, so we're going to smuggle that in instead. They passed the Tea Act in 73, which lowers the taxes for the East India Company, essentially allowing them to sell at a price that's even lower than the smuggled Dutch tea. Excuse me. And you'd think cheap tea would make the colonists happy. Isn't that the whole point of this? It pisses them off. It enrages them. They see this as basically the crown trying to squeeze the colonists out of business. You got to remember, these merchants are making a lot of money smuggling, and these merchants are some of the richest guys in the colony. They got a lot of pull. They got a lot of power. They have a lot of employees. So they see it as a way to try to squeeze them out. And they, through several channels, find out that the British are sending 1,300 chests of tea to be distributed throughout the colonies. A lot of the merchants who end up taking charge of the ports turn the ships around. They won't even let them disembark. They won't let them trade. They won't let them do anything. However, in Boston, we have what is now known as the Boston Tea Party. 150 guys disguise themselves as Native Americans, basically as a red herring. And they board the ship. They throw the tea in the harbor. And this tea is worth millions of dollars in today's money. And you're thinking, how could it be worth that much money? How could you possibly have that much tea worth millions of dollars on a ship? The way that tea is transported at this time is dehydrated and in bricks. Essentially, this tea was years worth of tea. It is it is essentially it's years worth of tea, because the way that it's sold is, you can think of it the same way as like astronaut food. Essentially dehydrated, debulked, in as small of a package as possible, to then be added to water to rehydrate to be used as tea. So when they're throwing these bricks into the ocean, it is hundreds of orders of tea, thousands of orders of tea, years worth of stock that they are just throwing overboard. Now, Parliament is very upset. Like I said, this was a lot of money. And they pass what we are now calling the Coercive Acts, designed to coerce the colonists into behaving, basically. These come around in 74, about 6 months later. First one is the Boston Port Act. Basically, Boston's not allowed to use its port until they pay for the tea that was destroyed. And we just said it's millions of dollars in today's money. It's going to take them a decade to pay that back. It's essentially shut down for business for good. The Massachusetts Government Act required all council members, judges, sheriffs, blah, 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 blah. Everybody who is of a position of the government in Massachusetts needs to be appointed by the governor. And the governor, who was British, is appointed by Parliament. So transitive property says all of these people are basically being appointed by the British Parliament. There are no longer elections. We are going to tell you who's in charge, and you're going to like it. Too bad, so sad. The Administration of Justice Act. Basically, if any British soldier or government official committed a crime in the colonies, they were extradited back to Britain because they knew that they wouldn't get a fair trial in the colonies. They knew that no matter what, they would be found guilty regardless, because not everybody, I just said there's a fair amount of people who didn't. But it was a scary enough number of people that they knew that odds were they were not going to get a fair trial in the colonies. So everybody was going to get extradited back to the UK for trial. And the Quartering Act, keep this in mind as we come back to the end of the American Revolution. Local officials had to provide housing for all these soldiers. And, this is still a time where there's not an excess of buildings, so private homes were very often used to house soldiers. And you can only imagine how that made the colonists feel. Probably not too great. Now, in addition to that, to enforce these acts, another 2 garrisons of troops, so another 2,000 troops are moved throughout New England from Britain. So people are not feeling great about this. Now, these coercive acts become known as the intolerable acts. If you guys have ever taken a class like this before, that's probably how they were introduced to you. When these 2,000 new troops came in, the colonists basically declared it an invasion. It's not a standing army anymore like it was around the time of the Boston Massacre. They genuinely believe that this is an invasion. And anybody who had any position of power, which was tough because of the Massachusetts Government Act, But those who did have power basically said, don't trade with Britain. We're going to do another boycott. It worked last time. And we need to get people over to Britain over to the colonial capitals, and then to a Congress. We have to get everybody together. We got to figure out how we're going to deal with this. And this is where we get the first Continental Congress, 1774 in Philadelphia, and we get the Suffolk Resolves. Not important to go into the details, to be honest with you. What you need to know about the Suffolk Resolves is basically it said, disobey the Coercive Acts, basically pretend like they're not there. We're going to do a little more civil disobedience. And also, maybe not a bad idea to arm yourselves. This may come to violence, and you need to be prepared for that. So, these people are getting prepared, and colonial militias are drilling, they're practicing, they're arming themselves, they're buying guns, they're stockpiling ammo. This is where we get the Minutemen in Concord. They're supposed to be, ready at a moment's notice. These were the frontline troops. They were the shock troops of the colonial militia. That's where UMass gets its mascot, the Minuteman. And in addition to creating and expanding colonial militias, what they're doing is creating their own colonial and local congresses. They're creating governments that are prepared to be separated from their British counterparts. And while that's happening, those expanding militias are raiding military depots for guns and ammo, cannons, supplies, anything like that. And obviously, Britain is not thrilled. This enrages a lot of people. Again, from Britain's point of view, all they're trying to do is pay off a war, and these colonists are just not letting them. So this is where we're going to end for the first one. We will get into the revolution itself in the next one. Let me know what you think. Let me know if you guys like this format. If you think anything should be changed, how's the mic, how's the visuals, anything like that. Like I said, this is the first video. So any constructive criticism I'm willing to take, anything we can make it better for everybody, just let me know. And I appreciate you. We'll see you in the next one.